Sauron and Morgoth were the two greatest evils of Arda, and their power and strength threatened the very existence of the Free People. Even though Sauron was once a simple servant of Morgoth, his power is often compared to that of his master, and it's quite interesting to wonder how close were they in strength, and was there any point in time when Sauron was actually stronger than Morgoth? Hey guys, it's Carl here, and in today's episode, we'll be comparing the power levels of Sauron and Morgoth. Now before I delve into this topic, I think it's really important to clarify that none of this is my own speculation, and that everything that I mention comes directly from Tolkien's own writings. I can already anticipate how controversial this topic will be, and so it's good to clear things up before anyone grabs their pitchfork. So there are two crucial things that we need to establish before we can compare Sauron's and Morgoth's power. Firstly, what do we mean by power and how can we measure it? And secondly, what time frame are we talking about? Now there are many ways to define power, such as a character's strength, their prowess in battle, the dominance of their armies, or even the reach of their influence. And in the case of Sauron and Morgoth, I believe the last two are most important. There's no doubt that both of them were great warriors on the battlefield, but it's not really what defined their power. After all, we know that Morgoth wasn't the greatest or strongest fighter, and that he was surpassed by Tulkas on the battlefield, and so I think that it makes much more sense to focus on their innate ability to exert their will on others and influence their surroundings. It's also very important to clarify what time frame we're talking about, for at the very start of Arda, Morgoth's power was far stronger than Sauron's, for he was the greatest of the Valar, and Sauron was only a Maiar spirit. These Maiar spirits were servants of the Valar, and Sauron wasn't even the strongest of these, since another Maiar spirit, called Eonwë, surpassed him in power, and so Sauron was intrinsically weaker than his master. Now Morgoth wanted to dominate the world of Arda, and to bring it under his control, and so he began to unleash the vast majority of his power into the physical lands of the earth, so that everything that was born and that lived upon it would have a part of his corruption. He would also infuse his servants with his power, such as the orcs, his dragons, and the werewolf Carcharoth, and these two things left Morgoth in a weakened state, for the vast majority of his power was now externalized. This weakness is one of the reasons why Morgoth began to depend so much on his armies, and why he avoided fighting on the front lines. And even though he now had an army filled with many terrifying creatures and servants, he was also much more vulnerable now. For since most of his power was concentrated in his armies, he would be left in a very weakened state if the Free People somehow managed to overcome them, since that power would be lost. And this is actually what happened to him in the War of Wrath. It was also one of the reasons why the Valar were able to overpower Morgoth and cast him into the void, for he was now much more physically vulnerable after spreading his power. Now it might seem like Morgoth's choice to divide his power was a rash and foolish plan, though I think that he had to take this risk to be able to challenge the Free People. We also shouldn't underestimate what a destructive force his army was and their formidable strength, and how great sacrifices would have to be made to overcome them. By transforming and dividing the majority of his spiritual power, Morgoth was able to gain a terrible grip on the physical world, so much so that an incredible amount of destruction would take place to overcome his armies in the War of Wrath. And the entire continent of Beleriand was destroyed and sank beneath the sea, which is a testament to their power and their destructive capabilities. Another interesting point is that Tolkien actually refers to Arda as Morgoth's Ring, which implies that Morgoth's corruption was similar to how Sauron infused the One Ring with his power and influence, though Morgoth did it on a much larger scale, since his corruption was in the world itself. Now thanks to Morgoth, Sauron had quite an advantage, for he inherited his master's servants and the corruption that Morgoth had spread throughout Arda, and so Sauron was able to conserve much of his own power, and his accomplishments were only possible thanks to his master's sacrifice. Without taking advantage of the foundation that Morgoth had prepared, Sauron would have had no choice but to expend more of his own power, which would have left him in a weakened state, similar to Morgoth. Sauron's plan to infuse the One Ring with his power was actually quite different to how Morgoth infused Arda with his own. For while the One Ring was in Sauron's possession, it actually increased his total power by acting like a catalyst of sorts, and so it made him stronger rather than weaker. If you'd like to learn more about why Sauron needed the One Ring, make sure you check out my video, which I'll be linking above. By keeping most of his power to himself, Sauron's armies were also much weaker than those of his master, and a lot less destructive, and so the lands of Middle-earth would suffer much less collateral damage to overcome Sauron's armies, especially when we compare it to the level of destruction that was needed to overcome the forces of Morgoth. Now, considering all of these points, we have a good understanding of how Morgoth's and Sauron's power changed over time, and so we can finally answer this question. I'll be using a quote from Tolkien to back this up, because I feel it wraps everything quite nicely. Sauron was greater effectively in the Second Age than Morgoth at the end of the First. Why? Because though he was far smaller by natural stature, he had not yet fallen so low. Eventually he also squandered his power of being in the endeavor to gain control of others, but he was not obliged to expend so much of himself. To gain domination over Arda, Morgoth had let most of his being pass into the physical constituents of the earth. Hence all things that were born on earth and lived on and by it, beasts or plants or incarnate spirits, were liable to be stained. The time of Melkor's greatest power, therefore, was in the physical beginnings of the world, a vast demiurgic lust for power, and the achievement of his own will and designs on a great scale. Now this means that towards the end of the Second Age, when Sauron had the One Ring in his possession, and while he was at the peak of his power, he was actually greater than Morgoth was at the end of the First Age, after he infused so much of his power into his servants and into the land of Arda. This is obviously comparing Sauron at his strongest and Morgoth at his weakest, and it's only taking into account their innate spiritual power and not the strength of their armies, for Sauron's forces would have been no match for the armies of Morgoth. Anyway friends, this wraps up today's video and I hope you enjoyed it. Do you agree with the points that I've discussed? And how powerful do you think Sauron was compared to his master Morgoth? And also, do you think that it was a smart move on Morgoth's part to give up so much of his power, or would he have been better off keeping it for himself? As always, I'd like to thank my patrons who have really helped to elevate this channel. It wouldn't be the same without you. And I would like to express how grateful I am for your support, especially our Wizard tier patrons, T. Gorman, Mike Feeney, Roland Mervold, and Jacob Williams. If you too would like to help support this channel while unlocking some cool perks, I'll be leaving a link to my Patreon page in the video description below. I'll also be leaving links to our Instagram, Facebook, Discord, and Twitter communities, so follow us if you'd like to have some extra Lord of the Rings content in your day-to-day lives. As always, if you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe to join our fellowship today. I hope to see you all in my next video, where together we'll once again explore the magical world and lore of Middle-earth.